I never set out to question the history books, but then I saw the buildings, the impossible glass domes spanning acres, the terracotta palaces with carvings we couldn't replicate today, the exhibition halls erected in months that would take us years. This wasn't primitive construction with horse-drawn carts. This was something inherited. And then, like clockwork, the disasters arrived. Fires that burned entire cities to ash, floods burying first floors overnight across continents, earthquakes timed with surgical precision. Ask yourself, what are the odds that every major city harbouring these impossibilities suffered catastrophic destruction within the same narrow window? And with each disaster, the cascade began. Construction techniques vanished, architectural plans burned, master craftsmen went silent, population records fragmented, census data that doesn't add up, orphan trains carrying hundreds of thousands from nowhere, asylums swelling with the confused entire family lines, erased. And that's when I stumbled onto the question that shattered everything. If there was a different world before ours, a civilization we've been told doesn't exist, where did all the people go? Not the buildings, not the architecture, the people, the witnesses, the survivors. Where are they? It began with photographs, late 1800s street scenes from cities across the world. San Francisco, Melbourne, Moscow, Buenos Aires, Chicago. I was researching urban development when I noticed something peculiar in image after image. Streets being excavated, buildings with their first floors partially buried, workers digging out entire city blocks. Official captions called it grading or street elevation projects. But the scale was wrong, the frequency was wrong, the timing was wrong. In San Francisco alone, between 1850 and 1915, the city appears to have excavated and regraded itself multiple times, not minor adjustments, entire neighbourhoods. And here's the strangest part. Nobody seemed to think this was unusual. No protests from property owners, no public outcry about the massive expense, no detailed records of where all that earth came from or went to. Just thousands of workers, day after day, moving incomprehensible amounts of soil, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. This raises a simple but critical question. If an event, or series of events, had covered substantial portions of cities worldwide in mud and debris, where are the first-hand accounts? Where are the survivors' stories? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across continents and decades. I started compiling reports from newspapers, municipal records, historical societies. What I found was not a conspiracy of silence, but something more subtle and more disturbing, a systematic absence of explanation. Take Chicago after the 1871 fire. The city rebuilds with astonishing speed, hundreds of elaborate buildings, including structures that would take years to construct, using conventional methods appearing in less than a decade. But when you look for detailed construction records, architectural plans, worker testimonies, the documentation is sparse, inconsistent. As if someone had taken great care to record that buildings went up, but not how or who built them. Or consider the great orphan trains of America, which operated from 1854 to 1929. The official narrative tells us that 250,000 children, possibly more, were transported from eastern cities to homes in the West and Midwest. We're told these were street children, offspring of immigrants, casualties of urban poverty. But the deeper I went into the records, the more the numbers stopped making sense. 250,000 children. That's not a social program. That's a demographic reset. And that's where the asylum records become impossible to ignore. Between 1840 and 1880, something extraordinary happened in the United States alone. The construction of hundreds of massive psychiatric institutions. These weren't small facilities. They were palatial structures, many built in that same ornate style we see in old world fairs and grand civic buildings. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the Athens Lunatic Asylum, the Buffalo State Asylum, the Oregon State Hospital, on and on. The official explanation is that this was a progressive movement, a reform effort to treat the mentally ill humanely. That explanation collapses here. The speed of construction, the architectural sophistication, the sheer number of beds, all of this happened during a period when we're told America was just emerging from frontier status. But here's what really troubles me. Who filled these asylums? The records, where they exist, show thousands upon thousands of patients with strikingly similar diagnoses. Melancholia, acute mania, amnesia, confusion of thought. Many with no recorded history prior to admission, no family records, no documented origins, just first names, sometimes surnames, and a diagnosis that seems designed to explain away one thing: memory loss. What if these weren't treatment facilities at all? What if they were containment centres? Think about it. If a catastrophic event had disrupted civilization on a massive scale, burying cities, displacing populations, destroying infrastructure, what would the aftermath look like? You'd have survivors wandering, disoriented, traumatized, people telling stories about the world before, stories that didn't match the new narrative being constructed, stories that had to be managed, not eliminated, not through violence, but redirected, contained, medicalized. What better way to discredit a witness than to institutionalize them, to label their memories as delusions, to mix genuine survivors with patients who truly needed care, creating a system where truth and madness became indistinguishable. The records show that many asylum patients were committed for reasons that seem absurd today. Political excitement, novel reading, religious enthusiasm, nostalgia. That last one appears again and again in intake records. Nostalgia. An excessive longing for the past, or perhaps a longing for a past that officially never existed. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider following this channel for more deep dives into architectural mysteries and lost history. But the adults could be contained, could be managed through institutions and social pressure. The children posed a different problem. Children talk, children remember, children ask questions their parents can't or won't answer. And so we have the orphan trains. 250,000 children removed from urban centres and dispersed across rural America, where they would grow up disconnected from their origins, integrated into families with no knowledge of their past, their memories written off as childish fantasy. The official records are maddeningly vague about where these children came from. Street children, homeless waifs, foundlings. But foundlings don't appear in groups of dozens or hundreds, and yet that's exactly what we see. Mass roundups of children processed through institutions like the New York Foundling Hospital or the Children's Aid Society, then shipped west with minimal documentation about their families or origins. Some researchers have noted the striking number of children in these programs with no memory of their parents. Not orphans with stories of loss, but children who simply couldn't remember. As if they'd experienced something so traumatic that entire portions of their childhood had been wiped away. What happens to a society's memory when you remove 250,000 of its youngest witnesses? Now expand this outward, because the pattern isn't limited to America. The deeper I looked, the more I found similar programs operating simultaneously across the world. Australia's child migration schemes, Canada's Home Children Programme, the British child emigration programs, Argentina's orphanages, Russia's foundling hospitals, all operating in the same rough time frame, 1850s through early 1900s, all moving children on a massive scale, all with documentation that seems simultaneously comprehensive and hollow. We have numbers, dates, names, but almost no stories, no voices, no memories preserved. This raises a simple but critical question that I keep returning to. How do you coordinate something like this globally? In an era before rapid communication, before international organizations, before the infrastructure we associate with global cooperation, how do dozens of nations simultaneously implement nearly identical programs for managing displaced populations? Not why they would, not when they decided, not under which authority. No, how? How is such coordination possible without leaving a paper trail that makes the coordination explicit? Unless it wasn't coordination at all, unless they were all responding to the same event. I mentioned earlier that this investigation started with buildings. Now we come back to them, because the architecture tells its own story about forgetting. Walk through any major city built before 1920, and you'll find structures that seem impossible for their claimed construction dates. Courthouses, train stations, libraries, exhibition halls, all built with a level of craftsmanship and architectural sophistication that supposedly belonged to civilizations we're told were primitive or non-existent just decades earlier. The evidence suggests something much larger. These buildings may not have been constructed during the periods claimed. They may have been excavated, repurposed, or simply relabeled. But to accept that possibility means accepting that an entire civilization's worth of infrastructure already existed, infrastructure that had to be explained away, or better yet, incorporated into a new narrative where it always belonged to us. But the buildings needed keepers, people to staff them, to operate them, to maintain them. And that's where we see another curious pattern, the rise of professional credentialing and certification in the late 1800s. Suddenly, you needed specific training to be an architect, a doctor, an engineer. Old knowledge that might have been passed down through experience or apprenticeship, was systematized, formalized, controlled. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The simultaneous erasure of one knowledge system and the implementation of another, not through force but through bureaucracy, through credentials, through the quiet insistence that the old ways were primitive, unscientific, dangerous. And who couldn't get credentials? The elderly, the traumatized, the asylum patients, the children scattered across rural areas, the witnesses. By the 1920s and 1930s, something shifts in the historical record. The gaps begin to close. Documentation becomes more consistent, photographs more abundant, personal testimonies more aligned with official narratives. It's as if the world suddenly snapped into focus, into the timeline we recognize. But here's what haunts me. That final generation that might have remembered. The people born in the 1850s and 1860s who would have been adults during the alleged Mudflood era, who might have told their grandchildren about the world before, they die off in massive numbers during World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic. Another demographic disruption. Another break in the chain of memory. I'm not suggesting these events were manufactured, but the timing. The thoroughness with which they removed the last witnesses who could have contradicted the established narrative. The convenient way they appeared just as the first generation born into the new order was coming of age. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. So, where did they all go? The Mudflood survivors, if they existed, the witnesses to whatever event or transition occurred, where are their voices? Some, I believe, ended up in asylums, their memories pathologized out of existence. Others scattered on orphan trains, their childhoods erased, their questions unanswered. Some probably integrated quietly, choosing silence over the social cost of being labelled mad or backward. Some died in the epidemics and wars that conveniently swept through just when their testimonies would have been most valuable. But mostly they went where all inconvenient witnesses go, into silence, not through any single dramatic act of suppression, but through 1,000 quiet pressures. Social pressure to conform, economic pressure to accept the new systems, medical pressure to doubt their own memories, educational pressure to abandon old knowledge in favour of new credentials. The evidence suggests something much larger than a simple cover-up. It suggests a wholesale reorganisation of civilization, so thorough and so well executed that within 2 generations the previous world had become myth. The survivors became patients, foundlings, scattered individuals with no collective voice. Their children became the first generation of the new order, born into a world where the past was whatever the textbooks said it was. I started this investigation looking for people. I found absences, gaps where voices should be, records that document everything except what matters, photographs that show the excavation but not the explanation, buildings that appear fully formed with no construction timeline, children arriving in trainloads with no origin story. The official history tells us that the late 1800s and early 1900s were a period of unprecedented progress, industrialization, and expansion. And maybe that's true. Maybe all those ornate buildings really were constructed in a few years by horse and buggy civilizations. Maybe 250,000 children really were all street urchins. Maybe the asylum boom really was just progressive reform. Maybe every major city really did need to excavate itself for routine grading projects. Maybe. But the questions persist. They accumulate. They form patterns that can't be explained away by coincidence or natural social evolution. Something happened. Something significant enough to require a global reset. Significant enough that witnesses needed to be removed, memories needed to be erased, and a new official history needed to be written. What happened to the Mudflood survivors? Perhaps the better question is, what would it take to make an entire civilization forget? What combination of institutionalization, relocation, credential systems, social pressure, and generational turnover? Would you need to replace one version of history with another in just 50 years? Not much, it turns out. Just asylums for those who remembered too clearly. Orphan trains for those who might someday remember. Wars and pandemics to remove the final witnesses. And time. Time for the last person who knew the truth to die in an asylum somewhere, their memories filed under delusions of grandeur or nostalgia for a place that never existed. I don't have answers, only questions that multiply the deeper I go, only patterns that repeat with unsettling precision, only absences where presence should be obvious, only silence where there should be voices. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and now neither can you.